Okay, good evening, everybody. This is Rick Davis, and we welcome you to AnCan's Plenary Fifth Monday presentation of this time on cancer, sleep, and dreams. I have everybody muted, I hope, uh, other than myself and the presenter. Um, Ruben Nye, Professor Dr. Ruben Nyman. And if you do come on, please mute yourselves if you're not muted so that we don't get any background. Um, for those of you who are new to our virtual groups and our virtual presentations, Cancer Cancer Foundation is a small nonprofit that provides support, um, advocacy, and navigation. Advocacy on a national level, navigation on a personal level, and we run virtual support groups. Right now, we're running 15 a month. We have several for prostate cancer. We have a women's breast cancer group, and we have a men's breast cancer group, and we have a caregivers breast cancer group. And if anybody happens to be listening in and is interested in starting a group with us as a peer, I would love to hear from you because we will start up groups for most any type of cancer and even non-cancers. I'm looking right now for a peer moderator for Parkinson's, for example. So we've been around doing this now since 2010 and in the form of Cancer Foundation. We're a 501c3 for just a couple of years. We run meetings every Monday night, except when there's a fifth Monday, and that's when we take the opportunity to bring in a guest speaker, and we are really, really lucky to welcome tonight Dr. Ruben Nyman, who is a recognized expert on sleep and dreams. And Ruben is a friend of mine. He lives locally to me down here in southern Arizona. And he has very graciously agreed to speak to the group tonight. Ruben teaches at the University of Arizona Medical School through the Arizona Integrative Medical Center, and for many years he's worked with Dr. Andrew Weil, who that's a name that may be familiar to many of you. He's a clinical psychologist, and as well as his teaching, he has a private practice. And you can find more about Ruben on his website. You can find more about this whole presentation, and we will actually post a recording of this presentation on our website, ancan.org. And if you're on GoToMeeting, I will put the link in the chat window if you are not familiar with it. Just a few housekeeping matters. As I mentioned early on, we're going to mute everybody except myself and Ruben. We cannot, unfortunately, because of the software that we're using with GoToMeeting, we're not going to be able to take questions online verbally. But if anybody has questions, you can either put them in the chat window and send them to me privately, or you can email me, and I'll put my email in the chat window right now, and I think I've put it on before, but you can send it to info@ancan.org, and I will forward it on to Ruben, and hopefully, well, if it didn't come up, I'll put it on again. But I'll forward all there it is, info@ancan.org, and I'll forward it on. So with that said, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ruben. We are scheduled for about an hour and a half. The slides are probably going to take 30 to 45 minutes, and so there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions from everybody. Like I say, put them in the chat window or send them to info@ancan.org, and I will be sure to move them along. Okay, Ruben, the floor is
Yes,
yours.
thank you. And thanks, Rick, for inviting me. This is a topic, as you know, that's dear to my heart. I'll just add, in terms of my introduction, that for the first 10 years of my career as a psychologist, my primary focus was on the psychology of cancer. At that time, I was specifically interested in the relationship of dreams to cancer, dreaming as an avenue for understanding and healing cancer. And over the past 30 years or so, I've expanded that to a general interest in sleep and dreams. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's also a challenge. This is a topic that, in addition to being of critical importance to both people with cancer and people in general, it turns out to be a topic that is complex, in part beyond the medical complexity. It's complex because, as you'll see, I believe that we have a profound misunderstanding in our world of what sleeping and dreaming is. I'm going to begin with kind of an overview. We're going to sweep through looking at common notions and misunderstandings of sleep and dreams. And one of my goals today is to help you begin to transform not only the quality of your sleep, but also your understanding of sleep. And I think the two go hand in hand. In order to do that, as you'll see, I believe very strongly that science and medicine has given us really important, critical, effective tools for addressing these issues. But I think one of the big problems is that we begin to limit our view of sleeping and dreaming as solely a biomedical issue. And it is not. Again, as much as medicine can contribute, and as Rick mentioned, I teach at a medical center and do research in that area. I think what we've lost with regard to dreaming is a softer side, a very poetic side that we need to merge with our scientific understanding. So having said that, let me begin by opening with an excerpt from a poem that I think is very relevant to what we're talking about. Some of you might be familiar with the work of David White, poet David White. And this is a poem entitled, "What to Remember When Waking." What to remember when waking. In that first hardly noticed moment in which you wake, coming back to this life from the other more secret, movable, and frighteningly honest world where everything began. There is a small opening into the new day, which closes the moment you begin your plans. What you can plan is too small for you to live. What you can live wholeheartedly will make plans enough for the vitality hidden in your sleep. To be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. To remember the other world in this world, to remember the other world in this world is to live in your true inheritance. So we're talking about the other world, the world of night consciousness, the world of sleep and dreams. And it's a world that we have been struggling with for decades. We are today in the midst of nothing less than an epidemic. Most of us are aware that we're in the midst of an epidemic of sleep loss. We're also, as I'll point out, in a very serious epidemic of dream loss. And so you have a slide here that you can look at your own leisure. I just want to highlight that there are at least 70 million American adults, more women than men, with insomnia, with sleep disorders. Another 20 plus million.
Oh, I'm just trying to hear you say if I'm on the right one.
I'm sorry, can you? No, I can't mute this person.
Oops.
Sorry, Ruben.
If you can hear me.
Yeah, if you could please mute. If you come on, if you could please mute.
Okay, thank you. And so the National Sleep Foundation found that roughly 64% of Americans on a regular basis report at least one symptom, at least a few nights a week or more, sleep issues. About a fourth of our kids today are beginning to have sleep problems. And the bottom line here is that this is associated with immense suffering, immeasurable suffering. So I want to focus in on the relationship of sleep to cancer in general for just a couple of slides. And when it comes to risk factors for cancer patients, there are three categories we need to talk about: illness factors, treatment factors, and psychological factors. So when we talk about aspects of the illness that can result in, cause, or exacerbate sleeplessness, we begin with paraneoplastic issues or syndrome. And some of you, or maybe most of you, are familiar with this. These are essentially side effects of cancer. They're not about the actual invasiveness of the tumor, which can cause obstruction, other symptoms, as you see. But these are side effects, often resulting in steroid problems, sometimes neurological problems, and so on. There are very common gastrointestinal and genitourinary changes. Again, many of you are familiar. These are certainly factors that can impede sleep. And generally speaking, in terms of illness factors, obviously there's pain, specifically headaches, cough, itching, night sweats, hot flashes, and so on. Some of these symptoms can be so intense that they become a primary cause of insomnia. More often than not, the symptoms will actually exacerbate an underlying predisposition for insomnia. But in any case, it's really between you and your doctor to talk about these specific symptoms and to focus in on managing them. And then we have treatment factors. You may or may not be aware that spending time in hospitals turns out to be a major cause of insomnia for many people. There's a lot of disruption at night. There's a disruption of circadian rhythms. It's easy to lose sight of whether or not it's night or day. Additional factors include medications and chemotherapy side effects. These are maybe the most obvious ones. And then the physical limitations that can be associated with treatment. Many people slow down necessarily, have limited energy for movement or for exercise, and this in and of itself can contribute to sleeplessness. And finally, maybe it goes without saying, we have psychological factors, psychosocial factors, the stress involved with the illness, the anxiety, and common depression, which is also associated with fatigue. I think it's helpful to look at cancer not only as an illness that individuals struggle with, but as a social illness. And again, many of you are probably aware of the fact that it impacts family members and caregivers in a different way, but often as much as it does the patient with cancer. So we have decent data now on the extent of sleep disturbance among cancer patients. It's extremely common. Somewhere around a third to a half of individuals with cancer will develop some insomnia, some significant insomnia. And what's also striking is that somewhere around 20 to 44% of patients will continue to have insomnia symptoms. They'll develop chronic insomnia for up to 5 years post-treatment. And this is, again, this highlights how important it is to really understand and address this, which unfortunately isn't done well. Insomnia is largely neglected in cancer patients for a lot of reasons. The data suggests that about 16% of patients will inform their physicians or their providers. And probably the reason for this is that sleeplessness is almost considered a normal reaction to cancer. And again, given the cancer and the severity of it, sleeplessness can recede to a lower priority. And the third point here is that doctors, oncologists, and other physicians who are involved in treatment don't often know the details of addressing a sleep disorder. They, and out of sensitivity of their patients, they're concerned that they might overburden their patients with treatment recommendations. So often this is set aside. And of course, many of you are aware that the most common response to cancer patients having sleep issues is medication. And we will talk about the pros, but mostly the cons of using medication to treat sleeplessness. And finally, sleep problems can have a negative impact on care. If you're not sleeping well, it preoccupies one's mood, it causes irritability. There is a reduction in the capacity to respond to treatment recommendations, increased stress on relationships, and again, it goes without saying, depression and anxiety. You know, there's just an interesting question we'll touch on a little more later about where people go when they go to sleep. And in waking life, when we are up and about, our eyes are open, the world around us is lit up, there's activity there, our attention gets drawn out into that world. We are naturally more extroverted when we're in the waking world. When we get into bed, and we pull the covers up and we turn out the light and we close our eyes, we often come face to face with emotions, images, cares, concerns, fears, anxieties, confusions that don't compete as well during the day. I'm often reminded of a line from an old Beatles song called "A Little Help from My Friends," and the line is, "What do you see when you turn out the light? I can't tell you, but I know it's mine." Now, in some cases, when all things are going well, that might be a beautiful experience. But sleeping with cancer for many people is not. And the best way, of course, maybe not of course, but the best way I will suggest of addressing these images and experiences that come out when we are alone with ourselves in bed at night is to address them, is to think about them and to talk about them. I will say more about that as we go along. So, bottom line here, and I'm not trying to be cute in saying this, but we don't get sleep because we don't get sleep. I believe the primary reason we're in the middle of an insomnia epidemic is we really don't know where we're going. And you know, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? We define sleep negatively in our world. And what I mean by that is not that we see it in a dark way, but we define sleep in terms of what it is not. Very similar to how we define health in our world. We define health as the absence of disease. We define health in terms of what it's not. It's not disease, it's not illness. And we think of sleep as being not waking or not consciousness. In fact, the technical term for deep sleep is non-REM, which of course means not dreaming. Well, all of this tells us what sleep is not, but it doesn't tell us what it is. And I think this is a huge factor that undermines our ability to get back to sleep. We also look at sleep as being sort of secondary to waking. It's valued in terms of waking world functions. You know, the belief is the only reason we need to sleep is to be better waking people. And that reduces the value in the experience of sleep. We see it as a servant of waking life. Something I've written about I call domestication. It's almost like we domesticate the wildness of sleep the way we domesticated wild animals. And I hinted at this earlier, sleep is also medicalized. Most of what you will see if you do a search for sleep online uh, are references to biomedical understandings of sleep. We think of sleep as something the brain does, the body does, our neurotransmitters are involved in, medications involved in. In the last 20 or 30 years, we have redefined our sense of sleep from a personal experience to a medical experience. And I just want to make the point that as important as it is to understand what goes on biomedically, the bottom line is the brain doesn't sleep. We do. It's a personal experience. Big picture here, we are in what I call a wake-centric era of consciousness. In the same way, many years ago, people commonly believed that the Earth, planet Earth, was the center of the universe. And dear Copernicus nearly lost his head for suggesting otherwise. Today, we believe waking consciousness, what we are doing now, being awake, is really the center of consciousness. This is the gold standard for being alive. And we see sleeping and dreaming as being secondary and subservient. And therefore, we don't fully grasp experientially what they're about. I think one of the ramifications of this, and this might sound strange to you, but I fully believe that the primary cause of insomnia is that we are addicted. And I don't use that word lightly, we are addicted to waking consciousness. So I will come back to that notion of addiction. We'll talk about its primary symptom, which is something we call hyperarousal. But I want to take a moment and step back and give you a kind of a larger overview from what we call an energy medicine perspective of what sleep is. So in contrast to defining it negatively, if you ask me what is sleep, here's what I would say. And I need to refer back to my dear deceased Jewish mother, may she rest in peace, for teaching me this. By the way, I had a classic mother, and I'll never forget, even as a little boy, you know, sometimes you look at your parents when you're a kid and you think, my God, that's weird. And I remember looking at the table in the dining room day after day thinking, you know, my mother made too much food. And kind of silently vowing to myself that when I grew up, that I would never make so much food. But I have to confess that even after many years of my own personal psychotherapy, I make too many slides, and I apologize for that. I just can't help it. I can't get through it. So we will go through as many of these as we can today and still allow. But what did my mother teach me about understanding sleep? This came from encounters I had with her when I was not feeling well. As a little boy, if I caught a cold or had a fever or just didn't feel well otherwise, my mother would always ask me three questions, three critical questions. These were part of a sort of a folk medicine evaluation. I should add, too, that my mother was raised in a small town in the South Central and imported some of those old folk ways when she and my father came to the U.S. So her first question was, did you eat? Classic Jewish mother question. But let's for a moment take this question, did you eat, and expand it. And what I want to do is talk about what today we call primary nutrition, which includes food and fluids. But primary nutrition is not just about what we're taking in through our mouths, but all of the energy that we are consuming in our world. And in addition to food and fluids, we consume information. We consume oxygen, breathe, and we consume light. When you step back at these primary energies, if you will, that we consume, they'll have one thing in common, and that's that we consume them excessively. In our world today, one of the great ironies is that we are overfed and simultaneously undernourished. We're going to make the argument as we go along that we are seriously overexposed to light at night. We consume too much light, and a lot of it, like food, is poor quality. If you're at all familiar with the Buteyko model, I won't go into detail. This is a medical model that understands health and well-being by focusing on respiration. But Buteyko made a really interesting point that we overconsume oxygen. His point was that we breathe too much. So we overconsume food and fluids. We overconsume light. We overconsume oxygen. And I think one doesn't need to make the argument, it's self-evident, that we overconsume information. Why am I emphasizing this? All of this consumption impacts us, impacts the body, the mind, the spirit as energy. We consume excessive amounts of energy. And there's an uncanny parallel, you know, between the energy we consume as individuals and the overconsumption of energy globally. There's another parallel, that all of this energy that we consume as individuals heats us up. It feeds into a condition called chronic inflammation, which many of you are familiar with. Chronic inflammation, in short, is about the immune system attacking itself, resulting in literally a measurable increase in core body temperature, which we'll talk about as we go on. But also it underlies all major illnesses, including cancer. So we want to reduce chronic inflammation. We want to reduce the excessive consumption of energy. Well, Mother's second question was, did you poop? Now, this is basic systems theory, isn't it? The first question, did you eat, is looking at all of the energy. And the second question is about what we're able to let go of. And one of the points I'm going to make as we proceed is that sleeplessness is associated with excessive energy and our inability to release sufficient energy for us to literally cool down, to descend, to slow, to land at night, to get grounded and to sleep. So this is a question about letting go. And as we letting go, surrendering waking consciousness in particular is a key process many of us understood intuitively when we slept well, particularly as children, but have lost sight with. And not surprisingly, my mother's last question was, did you sleep? She would ask, did you sleep? Did you dream? What did you dream? So to continue to answer the question, what is sleep? I'm going to make the point that sleep is rhythmic. Sleep is literally cool. If you're not sleeping well, you're not cool. And sleep is essentially serene. So many of us today are familiar with rhythmicity, and it's what I refer to as the power of when. There are three essential rhythmic cycles or patterns that govern our lives. They're so big that they are so much part of the infrastructure of life that we tend to lose sight of them. And most people who don't sleep well have not recognized the profound impact that that disconnection from rhythmic energy has on their sleep. So there are circadian rhythms. Of course, this is the ebb and flow of light and darkness, of night and day. These are like tides of daily life, and they breathe subtly but powerfully in the background of our lives. It's really important to reconnect with that sense of rhythm. There are ultradian rhythms, which are the waves of life. These are various rhythms that are smaller than a day. And the most common one are sleep rhythms. These are 90-minute rhythms. We'll see that flow through the night. There are infradian rhythms, which are larger than a day. Menstrual cycles are probably the best example of this. We are not clear scientifically the impact of infradian rhythms on us. I think psychologically and spiritually, the evidence is pretty strong that lunar phases impact our lives. And I think that when the moon is full, we ought to be out dancing naked in the woods. And finally, the point here is that most of us have disconnected or disentrained from natural rhythms. We're not listening to that really essential drumbeat that tells us when to be awake and when to rest, when to be active and when to sleep. But we tune into the rhythms of culture, and they are fairly hectic, staccato, and certainly not supportive of our sleep. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I apologize for the complexity. But what we have here is a standard, what we call the sleep histogram, and it depicts these waves. You see these little dips that occur in cycles 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 through the night. And each of those cycles includes a period of deep sleep or stage sleep. What you see is S1, S2, S3, stage 1, 2, 3. Stage 3 is the deepest kind of sleep. And then you'll see at the top these little purple lines that represent the amount of time we spend in REM sleep or dream sleep, which increases through the night. The blue arrow that dips down and comes back up represents body temperature. This is really important. We need to cool at night. Our body is designed to do exactly what the outer world does. When the sun goes down outside, no matter where you are on planet Earth, temperature gradually drops through the night. It decreases, reaches its lowest point before and then it sweeps back up again. Temperature rhythm is intimately tied to melatonin, and the green arrow, you notice that as the blue arrow goes down, the green arrow rises. As melatonin levels naturally rise through the night when we're exposed to dim light and darkness, they peak out when our body temperature reaches its lowest point. So normal rhythms of melatonin are essential in helping us manage our body temperature. And you might also notice that when our body temperature is at its lowest point and our melatonin is at its highest point in cycle number 5, we are also experiencing the longest, most protracted period of REM sleep. Last but not least, there's a dotted schematic line in red that runs across this, and this is not figuratively accurate, but it shows that what happens in insomnia is temperature rhythm does not dip. It cools a little bit, But I'm sorry to say, but people with insomnia are just not cool people. And if you want to be cool, you really need to learn to chill out at night to let your body temperature drop. And it's essential to do that in order to get good sleep. Okay, I'm going to move through this slide rather quickly. I just want to make a couple of fast points here, and you can look at it again at your own leisure. Well, this slide is about delta sleep, which is the deepest sleep we get. And in delta, there's a profound, refreshing process that goes on in the body and in the brain. We generally tend to lose delta as we go on. We are biologically programmed for significantly more delta sleep. Many of us, including myself, believe it is the primary reason women live 6 years longer than men do. Infants and children have a lot of delta. It drops off between the ages of 11 and 14. I suspect that that significant 25% drop in delta may be the cause of a very common condition in our world that we call adolescence. Delta decreases across the lifespan. In our world, we see a drop in the 40s, and then it's often absent at age 75. This is not true for everybody, and it is not clear whether or not this is natural aging or the result of how we age in our world. I believe the latter is true. And reductions in delta sleep are associated with many illnesses, including cancer. So, what is sleep? There is a song I wish I could be playing here, but it's not showing up on this slide. Some of you may be familiar with the Beatles song Golden Slumbers. And roughly the lyrics run, once there was a way to get back home, once there was a way to get back home, sleep, pretty darling, do not cry, and I will sing the lullaby. These were lyrics that Paul McCartney took an old lullaby that dated back 300 years. And what's fascinating about this is if you look at the history of our understanding of sleep, people at that time, I think, had a richer and I would say even more accurate sense of what sleep was than we do today. They didn't see sleep as absence of waking or the absence of consciousness. They saw sleep as the path, sleep as something that took them back to a deeper part of their own nature. I believe that based on spiritual writing across traditions around the world and based on what we are learning in science just in the last few years, that sleep is our default consciousness. What I mean by that is that beneath it all, I believe that we are all always already asleep. That sleep is not a place we go to. That sleep is a fundamental structural level of consciousness that always resides within us, at the foundation, if you will, at the floor of consciousness. So we never really have to go to sleep. We simply have to learn to and be willing to let go of waking. I also believe that deep sleep is our deepest self. And for people who are interested in personal growth, personal psychological or spiritual growth, that we are taken in deep sleep by grace. There's nothing we need to do except to be willing. We're taken into our deep self. And whatever might keep me from connecting with deep sleep, exactly what keeps me from connecting with the deepest part of myself. Let me just say too, there's a very common belief in my field of sleep medicine that it's impossible to be aware of sleep except for sleep or dream sleep. And we now have evidence to support what Tibetan Buddhists and Hindus and Kabbalists have been writing about for years, and that's that we actually can learn, we can cultivate the capacity to experience deep sleep. And it's a capacity to experience directly a profound sense of serenity. So just a quick note here on what is dreaming. Most of my colleagues tend to include that dreaming as a subset of sleep, and I think it's a problem. I think dreaming needs to be addressed as its own experience, and I'm going to make the point shortly that we are also in the midst of an epidemic of REM sleep or dream loss. In short, the data we have today says that dreaming performs some essential functions. It consolidates memory. It actually helps us regulate our negative moods. People who dream heal more quickly from emotional loss. In essence, dreaming digests daytime experiences. It metaphorically processes everything that we experience during the day that hasn't really sat well with us. The dream also gives us an opportunity to expand our consciousness. It allows us to see with what I call dream eyes. It gives us the experience of being conscious outside of the constraints of being in the body. In one sense, we can say that dreaming is actually an out-of-body experience. Dreaming has been studied both from a scientific perspective as REM sleep and from a psychospiritual perspective in terms of recent interest in shamanic traditions from around the world. I just want to share a brief little poem about this by Ron Lang, a great researcher, psychiatrist in consciousness. He said, "The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there's little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds." This is a beautiful invitation to humility, to recognizing, as Schopenhauer said, that most people mistake the limits of their own perception for the limits of the universe. I really believe healthy dreaming is a key natural process to help us surmount that very, very common condition of perception. Healthy dreaming supports creativity and supports our spirituality. And in addition to sleep loss, we are in the midst of an epidemic of REM sleep suppression and dream loss. I recently published a paper for the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences trying to call global attention to this. The bottom line is we are at least as dream deprived as we are sleep deprived. Excessive alcohol suppresses dreaming. Hypnotics, most sleeping pills can interfere with dreaming. Most antidepressants interfere with dreaming. If you're familiar with anticholinergic drugs, a lot of allergy medications, they interfere with dreaming. LAN, light at night, which suppresses melatonin, will also interfere with dreaming. Sleep disorders, obstructive sleep apnea that's not treated, middle insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night, routinely using an alarm clock to wake up snips off the end of your dreams. And of course, we live in a world where dream is dismissed. It's so interesting to me that one of the most common uses of the word dream in our world today is to refer to residential real estate. The American dream has been reduced to a house. So I mentioned that this excessive consumption of energy results in something we call hyperarousal. This is a concept that's been studied extremely well in science. We've looked at what goes on in the brain, in the body, and behavior. And hyperarousal in my work is an addiction to waking life. And it really significantly impedes sleep and dreams. If getting to sleep is about letting go of waking, and if we are addicted to waking, we believe waking is all there is, we are stuck. So again, you can read through some details of hyperarousal here. I want to emphasize a couple of things. One is it's associated with an accelerated heart rate and an accelerated head rate. It's almost an addiction to thinking. And when people can't sleep, they try to use leverage. They go back into the waking world. They try to use their waking to leverage back to sleep. It doesn't work. Hyperarousal is also strongly linked to elevated core body temperature and inflammation. It's associated with something I've written about that I call being twired. You are simultaneously tired and wired. What hyperarousal does is it keeps people flying at an excessively high waking altitude during the day, which doesn't give them enough time to descend and land in sleep at night. Symptomatically, hyperarousal often masks the daytime symptoms of sleepiness, but it also interferes, obviously, with getting to sleep at night. So I think it's very helpful to step back and get a big picture of the essence of sleep. And to do that, for many years, I've become interested in mythology from around the world, especially Greek mythology. And the next slide has an image of the Greek goddess Nyx, who is facing to your left, the mighty goddess of night, and her sweet-natured son, who always looks a little bit stoned, who is Hypnos, the god of sleep. This image depicts two critical forgotten truths about sleep. One is sleep itself, here embodied, here personified as the Greek god sleep. Sleep is the child of night. Hypnos is the child of the goddess of night. Sleep is born of night. And one of the most important things I will share with you is night itself, in its pure, unadulterated form, uncontaminated by light and noise and other pollutants. Pure night is absolutely the best sleep medicine. Truth number one. Truth number two, you'll notice that Hypnos is carrying a bundle of poppies in his arm, and he's sprinkling them down to the planet below. This is reminiscent, isn't it, of the classic story many up with I'm blocking his name. The fellow who would sweep into your room at night and sprinkle sleepy dust over your eyes. You know who I'm talking about. So this image depicts a very critical, forgotten truth about sleep, and that's that sleep is grace. Just as Hypnos drizzles these poppies down to the planet below, sleep is given to us. Sleep is the default. It's given, the potential for sleep, I should say, is given equally to everybody. Nyx, the goddess of night, has been in exile for at least 100 years now. With the advent of light at night toward the end of the 1800s, the planet began to glow at night. And this is one of thousands, tens of thousands of satellite images that have been taken over the past 50 years. And the planet glows. If you line these images up day after day, year after year, it glows at night. In fact, if planet Earth were being observed from above by aliens or extraterrestrials or angels, if we were being watched from above, the most profound change that would have been witnessed is this pernicious illumination of night. The planet grows brighter and brighter, brighter and brighter and brighter year by year. And the same kind of chronic inflammation that results from excessive exposure to energy in us as individuals is reflected on a global level with excessive exposure to light at night and heat around the planet. The planet, Al Gore once said, has a fever. And from a global perspective, what we're looking at now is the primary cause of insomnia. There's a very dark side to light. Let's see if I have that. Very dark side to light. Let me just say very quickly, light at night, once again, significantly suppresses melatonin. Even small amounts of light suppress melatonin. Light that comes out of our devices, our TV screens, computer screens, smartphones, and so on, also has a very strong element of the blue wavelength of light, which we know specifically suppresses melatonin. So it is so important to dial the light down at night, and especially to find ways of screening out the blue wavelength of light. So I want to focus in just for a few minutes on specific things that we can do to heal our sleep loss. And I want to emphasize at the start, you know, if you get on the internet, and maybe many of you have done this, and you Google sleep tips, you're going to find literally millions of entries. And I want to strongly make this the point that as a standalone intervention, if you follow all the sleep tips, the good tips, they will not help you. Sleep tips are necessary, but they're not sufficient. We have really good data on this. In sleep medicine, we refer to this as sleep hygiene. We know that if we give insomnia patients sleep hygiene recommendations, they will not cure their sleeplessness. If we combine that with other approaches that create a transformation in the way we understand sleep and the way we relate to sleep, including something we call CBTI, cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia, which, by the way, are available through many really good internet programs, then the sleep tips will work. So, more specifically, there's a very common notion of taking something to sleep. This might include some turkey sandwich or some warm milk or any number of things. But today, more and more, for more people, it includes taking medication to sleep. Both over-the-counter and sleeping medications, bottom line, are not a good idea. I'm not suggesting that in a rough night or two, it's going to harm you to do that. But a large percentage of people who start taking these medications on a short-term basis become chronically dependent on them. And without going into detail, I will just share with you, it is not a pretty picture. These medications do not replicate normal sleep. They essentially suppress the sleep that an individual feels. And in the long run, they can actually increase the risk for serious illness. So it's not a very good idea. There are, as you see at the bottom of the slide, CAM or complementary and alternative medicine, botanicals and nutraceuticals. These work better, in my opinion, and are unquestionably a lot safer. If we have questions about these, I can go into some detail. I just want to say right now, there is really good data on using valerian, something called L-theanine, an acid we extract from tea, jasmine as an aromatherapy, and also melatonin. Unfortunately, many people who use these approaches misuse them. There isn't really good data. So if you're choosing to do something like this, find a well-informed health practitioner who will guide you through it. So a very critical point here is that there are a number of medical issues that are known to wake us up at night: frequent urination, heartburn, other breathing disorders, snoring, perimenopausal symptoms, restless leg, peripheral movements, of course, pain and discomfort, bad dreams. But the real point I want to make here is that what wakes us up at night is not typically what keeps us up. It is actually possible to wake with a little pain here and there, or a flash of heat that moves through you, or to use the restroom, and to get back to sleep. But many of us operate like what I call the princess and the pea, that we overreact. So what wakes us up at night doesn't typically keep us up. What keeps us up is a psychological overreaction. People wake up and they go, oh, damn, I'm awake. And that reflexive, hurling an expletive at, going to battle with the wakefulness, immediately heightens anxiety and makes it hard to get back to sleep. So if we can actually learn to greet middle of the night awakenings with serenity, to recognize that sleep is not that far away, it can be very, very helpful in not keeping us awake for longer. Excuse me. So there is ultimately an art to sleep. And I want to share this poem, which I think, in my experience, has captured the essence of sleep more than anything I've ever read in a medical text or even a good book on sleep. This is a poem by Mary Oliver, and it's called Sleeping in the Forest. She says, I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, stone on the riverbed. Nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night, I heard the small kingdoms of breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in darkness. All night, I rose and fell, as if in the water, grappling with the luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. I strongly would encourage you to get to know this poem well. There's a spirit behind it. There's a soul in this poem that has a profound effect on our sleep. But I want to emphasize 2 points. She says, all night I rose and fell. And the points I want to emphasize is that in healthy, natural sleep, the body falls. We talk about falling asleep. The body falls and the spirit rises. The body falls in sleep. We let go of the body. If you're familiar with dogs, dogs are often considered in Jungian psychology the archetype, the great symbol of humility. And dogs have a great capacity to sleep. They can drop in the middle of a frenzied place like a bag of bones or spiral down into the ground and be asleep in a matter of seconds. Our relationship, as we see in Mary Oliver's poem, she touches back into the earth. Our relationship with the earth, metaphorically, is critical for sleep. The antidote to the hyperarousal that keeps us from descending to sleep, the antidote to hyperarousal is humility, is simply humility. It's the willingness to let go, to submit our bodies to gravity. And in very practical terms, if you feel that there's an energy in your body that won't calm down, I would encourage you to experiment with weighted blankets. These are becoming more and more popular now. They are blankets that have pockets, much like comforters, but instead of being filled with these fluffy white down feathers, they're filled with beans or corn or something that creates a sense of gravity, which is really helpful in comforting the body and letting the body go down into sleep. The body falls in sleep and the spirit rises. Most of us make a critical mistake in trying to get to sleep by thinking the common thought, I am going to sleep. It's a mistake because the part of us that we call I, the part of me, the part of you that calls us I, is incapable of sleeping. The part of me that I call I is the waking self. It simply can't go to sleep. Often we will crank up sleepiness. We'll stay up late so that our sleepiness might override this waking self. That's a crashing approach to getting to sleep. It may work in the short run, not in the long run. But the part of us that we call I cannot go to sleep. If you remember earlier, I suggested that we actually never need to go to sleep because sleep is already inside of us. We need to let go of waking. From the perspective of the part of me that I call I, falling asleep is an accident. And I cannot make an accident happen, or it wouldn't be an accident. Our belief that we can control sleep, that the waking self can control sleep, is a great impediment to sleep. Falling asleep is also an act of faith. It's letting go of the I and trust, in terms of trusting that there's something outside of the waking self that is there. There's a part of myself. And Hypnos, the Greek god that I spoke about just a few minutes ago, had a twin brother. His twin brother was Thanatos, the god of death. Now, this is not a very popular issue in talking about sleep, but in virtually all spiritual traditions around the world, there is a recognition that there's a kind of psychological dying that goes on. And the willingness to do that is the willingness to sleep. Okay, let me wind down. I'm going to push past this slide only by saying, sharing with you that we believe we sleep alone, but social sleep, we sleep with others. Even if there's no one in our bed, we're sleeping with the world around us. And let me wind down here with the question I mentioned at the start today. And the question is, where do you go when you go to sleep? This is a little excerpt from one of my favorite sleep books written by the famous sleep doctor, Dr. Seuss. And in this book, he has these mysterious amalgamated animals and talks about their sleep ritual. The one that's pictured in this slide, the Chippendale Mupp, He says, refers to him and says, his tail is so long he won't feel any pain till the nip makes the trip and gets up to his brain. In exactly 8 hours, the Chippendale muck will at last feel the bite and yell, ouch, and wake up. This is a really beautiful story aimed at teaching children what I think is a profound lesson that most adults have forgotten, and that's about the deleterious effect of the alarm clock. When most of us go to sleep, at least on what we might call school nights or work nights, we set an alarm. The vast majority of Americans set an alarm. And it's interesting, we kind of feel that we have to corral sleep. We have to set a limit and say, hey, sleepy, you can't continue beyond this point. We do our ritual, we get ready for bed, we set the alarm, we get into bed, we turn out the light, and then we're back to the question, where do you go when you go to sleep? Most of us do not descend metaphorically with our third eye open, with our heart open, into the deep, dark, sweet waters of sleep. If you ask most people where their thoughts go when they turn out the light, they will tell you they don't go towards sleep or dreams. Their thoughts actually aim at the shoreline of tomorrow morning's awakening. They've set the alarm clock to let them know when that shoreline arrives. This is like taking a beautiful overnight getaway, but spending the entire time planning what you're going to do when you get back to the waking world. So one of my suggestions is, metaphorically, go to sleep with your third eye open. Ask yourself the question, what do you see when you turn out the light? Recognize that there's something there for you, and allow yourself to practice mindfully, open-heartedly, descending into that space. Okay, a summary here of things you can do. One is join a sleep and or dream support group. If there isn't one around, organize one. You don't actually need a professional to do this. It may help if you want to do cognitive work, but it's really critical to get social support. Pay attention to your dreams. Think about them. Awaken slowly in the morning. What we call grogginess is a hybrid state of consciousness. The dream is present if we don't go chasing it. Linger in grogginess for a few minutes. Your dreams will come up. Bring them into the waking world. Start to build the bridge. Journal them. Talk to your dreams. Talk to people who value dreams about your dreams. Consider melatonin use. The bottom line here is always use a sustained release form of melatonin and use a relatively small dose. I should mention something you might know, that there is good data for using megadoses of melatonin as an adjunct to treating certain non-immune system metastatic cancers. In the Center for Integrative Medicine where I work, we will frequently use megadoses, again, as an adjunct to treating certain cancers. And there's some interesting impact of melatonin on dreams that I believe may be useful there. I'm also a believer in yoga and meditation, some kind of relaxation practice daily alongside of an exercise practice. Mindfulness meditation, particularly in the form of MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction, championed by John Kabat-Zinn. There are MBSR programs all over the world now in most large communities. You'll find a number of them going. Practice using your dream eyes, relax during the day, and imagine that you're looking at the world as if it's a dream. And last but certainly not least, if your insomnia persists, see a CBTI practitioner, cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. You can find them easily on the web. Recommended reading, there's an article on the website called AnCan that I've written called Falling for Sleep, which goes into more detail on a number of the points I made today. This is a complimentary website. I encourage you also, if you're interested in more encouragement, to look at my last book, Hush. This is a simple one-a-night reader that distills out my basic recommendations for sleep. And last but not least, here's some contact information. And we will pause here and I guess begin to look at questions. And Rick, I have these in my inbox now. Okay, so I will read the question and then we'll see what we can do in terms of responding to it. First question.
I was just going to say, Ruben, why don't you take us, there's a lot of questions in there, so take take a second to look through some of the questions.
Mhm.
I just want to remind everybody that if you have a question, you can put it in the chat box, or if you're on the telephone, you can send it to me at info at AnCan.org, and I will forward it on to Ruben. So he sees all the questions. He'll be able to. We've got questions on melatonin, on restless legs, on sleeping with and without a partner, on sleeping indoors and outdoors.
Well, Rick, excuse me, I'm not sure what you're suggesting. And there are a lot of questions here. I don't really want to take the time to scroll through and read all of them, but I don't have a problem with at least responding to every one of them. I
Okay.
presume, yeah. So let me just begin with the first, and I'll go through. The question or the comment here is, I have had long-term sleep problems and have occasionally taken 10 milligrams of Ambien before bed. I have no problem falling asleep, but cannot stay asleep. Since being diagnosed, it's gotten worse. I take 10 milligrams every night at 11:30 to midnight, sleep 2 hours, and then wake up with my mind racing. Same thoughts over and over again, and do not fall back until about 5 to 5:30, and then I will doze, getting up at 7 for work. So I imagine that unfortunately, this is not an uncommon experience. And what you're saying here is that you had a sleep issue, which is true for millions of us prior to being diagnosed, and the diagnosis, it sounds like, exacerbated that. So Ambien is a complex medication. It was originally developed for short-term use. 10 milligrams is considered the maximum dose of Ambien. Despite being developed for short-term use, most people who take it will take it on a very long-term basis, meaning years and years. There is pretty strong data now showing that Ambien disrupts our sleep pattern. I showed you a sleep histogram before, so you are not necessarily getting good sleep. There are programs available for tapering or discontinuing from these sleep medications. Often when you choose to do that, there's a rebound. And the bottom line in what you're describing is what we call habituation. And that means that if you take a medication for a long time, it does not work as effectively over time. Your system habituates, it becomes a habit, and people end up taking more and more, which is unfortunate and not necessary. So the medication clearly is not working. And I would talk to my doctor about this and see what the alternative is. One option is to really focus in on psychological, psychospiritual approaches, focus in on correcting your sleep rhythms. You're awakening with racing thoughts, which tells me beyond a doubt that hyper-arousal is a factor here. Rest practices are very critical in that. So I know I'm running through this in kind of a summarized way. I think the most important thing that I can say to the individual who sent this is there is hope. And I don't mean to sound insensitive. I get how dire it can feel and how terrible it is to wake up night after night. And again, you're saying you have to get up to go to work the next day. But there are ways of addressing this. There are non-medication ways you can use to address this. Okay, next question. Okay, Rick, are these stacked? I'm getting the same one.
So the next question starts, due to aftermath of prostate cancer.
Due to aftermath, sorry, of prostate cancer treatment, I find I will often awake every 2 hours or less throughout the night. Ways to deal with this disruption. So one question becomes, what is going bump in the night? Is this nocturia, awaking to have to use the restroom? Is it pain related? Is it heat related? Are there night sweats? So we want to see, or are there a number of things? And the first step is to do what we can medically to manage that symptom. And then if we can even get a reduction in that, what we want to do is not exacerbate the awakening. The individual here doesn't say how long they're awake, and it's actually not necessarily a problem to wake up a few times at night if you're getting back to sleep rather quickly. In fact, there are normally 4 or 5 what we call micro awakenings during the night. You know, every time you turn and pull the covers or fluff your pillow, there's a small awakening. We're so close to sleep that it's not a full awakening. We don't come up and out of the waters of sleep. We stay in there. But even if you woke up, opened your eyes, and you're awake for a little bit, then and you can get back to sleep pretty quickly, that's not a problem. There is a very effective treatment for middle of the night insomnia, or actually it works for sleep onset insomnia as well. That's called stimulus control. Stimulus control. This was devised and researched at length by a colleague of mine, Dick Bootson, who sadly passed away recently. But there are literally dozens and dozens of studies that support this. And you can look this up on the web. It's very easy to understand. The bottom line with stimulus control is you get out of bed if you're awake for more than a few minutes at night. You don't want to, quote, contaminate the bed with wakefulness by tossing and turning and struggling to get back to sleep. That makes it harder night after night. The other thing I'll add to this is that, and this is going to sound simple, but I can't emphasize how important it is. It is really critical to avoid looking at the clock when you can't sleep. And the temptation is great. We want to bring waking world control into the night, and we do so by trying to structure our awakening in time. Do everything you can to not look at the time. When you awaken and you're craving to know what time it is, it turns out that it's always the same time. It's nighttime. Next question. Okay, because PC is a man's disease, okay, prostate cancer, is it useful for us to read not only diagnostic treatment books and articles, but also books like Iron John, oh, interesting, and King Warrior, Magician, and Lover. Can you speak to getting physiological help as well as medical treatment, medical help? So the first part of this question is interesting, and the scientific answer I have to that is I don't know. The psycho-spiritual answer is hell yeah. I think it's really interesting, you know, with prostate cancer to really look more deeply into what being a man energetically, psychologically, spiritually means. Again, I don't know if that is curative. I think it may be chicken soup. It couldn't hurt, and it may well help. So I think Iron John, for example, and King Warrior Magician are exceptional books. So I would say yes. Can I speak to getting physiological help as well as medical? If I understand the question, we're talking maybe about alternatives, complementary and medical alternatives. Britt, do you think that that's what that question says?
I am really not sure what is meant by physiological as well as medical help. I would interpret it as being maybe the role of exercise as physiological help, but maybe I have a bias.
Well,
So if
certainly.
you know me, I may have a bias in there.
Well, I think it's a very, very helpful bias. That understanding the question, I'd certainly emphasize the need to get good medical support. I'm not sure what physiological means, and maybe it does refer to exercise. Okay, next question. Is there an ideal length of time to nap during the day when dealing with extreme fatigue, or should it be open-ended? Great question. Excuse me. So first of all, if you're having difficulty sleeping at night and you're able to avoid naps, do so. Napping is a very good thing to do when your sleep rhythms are intact. But if you're having insomnia, you're having trouble falling asleep, you don't want to reduce what we call sleep load by sleeping during the day. The ideal nap, again, under usual circumstances, is about 20 minutes in length, and it's positioned roughly in the middle of the waking day. But that's the question of ideal actually falls by the wayside when we're dealing with illnesses. Um, and your question is really about fatigue, and I'm glad you bring that up because so many people confuse fatigue with sleepiness, and they're two very different things. They may overlap, and they often overlap, but sleepiness is your head is feeling heavy, your eyes are rolling back in your head, and you just want to go out. Right? Fatigue is really a heaviness in the body, in the muscles. It's a lack of energy. And they actually need to be treated in different ways. Sleepiness calls for sleep. Fatigue calls for rest, waking rest. If you try to get yourself to sleep when you're fatigued, you're only going to get frustrated. And I worked as a consultant in a chronic fatigue clinic for years and become very interested in fatigue. I believe there's a relationship between fatigue and dream loss, not just sleep loss, but fatigue is a symptom of dream loss. So fatigue, once again, calls for rest. And if you rest during the day, which I strongly recommend you not do in the bed that you sleep in at night, do it on a sofa, do it somewhere else. But if you rest during the day, let your mind go into what we call the waking dream. Just let it go idle and let it expand and roll along. And sometimes interesting images will come up, but don't pressure yourself to sleep. Next question. Do we sleep better alone or with a partner? Yes. Okay, well, here's what we know. Sleep is a social event for most mammals, if you will, and certainly for humans. There is a strong trend today for solo sleep, and there's some complex reasons for that. What we know scientifically is that women sleep better when they sleep alone. Men sleep better when they sleep with a partner. You're all muted, but I'm going to give you a few moments to laugh there and to say that. So this is in our world today, and this doesn't necessarily reflect the natural norm, if you will. I think learning to sleep with another is a real specific skill, and I've written about this. I've written pieces about sleeping together. The whole concept has become, I think, entangled with sexuality. In fact, the term sleeping together for most people conjures sex. But there's something that's much deeper and richer in that. Without going into detail, I'll say that I think learning to sleep together, getting in train, getting in rhythm together, if it's feasible in a relationship, can actually deepen intimacy between two people. Next question. Has our Western culture lost something by bringing sleep indoors and placing it upon a mattress rather than spending the night connected with the earth itself? Great question, and I'm actually writing about this now. There's a concept I call domestication. There was a brief reference in one of the earlier slides. Domestication in this context refers to human beings living over thousands of years more deeply indoors. So our buildings, our homes, our schools, our offices are significantly less permeable to the outdoor environment today than they were even 50 years ago, let alone 100 or 200 years ago. Our glass is thicker, it screens out more light, our walls are thicker. There are many buildings that we refer to as being sick, poor air circulation. There is a monotonous temperature for most of us indoors, which is so different than nature. So I wouldn't go so far personally, although, by the way, before I say this, let me just say the single best treatment we have, the single best high technology, scientific supported treatment we have for insomnia is to go camping. So you're touching on that intuitively. But here's one caveat. You need to have all of your devices surgically removed from your body before you go camping. So you can't bring this stuff along, okay? That's really critical. For some people, the weekend, for some people, 4 or 5 days in nature automatically entrains them. There's low blue light. There are probably lots of other forces in nature that we're not even aware of. But yes, the bottom line here is what's been called nature deficit disorder is certainly a factor in our sleeplessness. And we've corralled sleep. You know, again, if sleep is a wild being, We've dragged it from its natural home in the world, and we make it live indoors. We can do that with some animals, but not with sleep. Thank you for that question. Oops. Okay. Next question. What is the impact of taking melatonin 20 milligrams or more per day? Depends. So I mentioned that we sometimes use megadoses of melatonin as an adjunct to treating cancer. There is, I think, very decent data. A lot of this coming out of Europe. There's some longitudinal studies. There are dozens of clinical trials where we find megadoses of melatonin can help slow the progression of cancer. So when I say megadoses, usually we're talking a minimum of 20 milligrams. CTA cancer treatment centers and some colleges I know we use 40, 50, 60, 80 milligrams. What does that do? There is some belief that some cancers are associated with the chronic suppression of melatonin. I actually believe there's good data on that. Some of it's been challenged, but it may well be that it reverses that. We don't know for sure, but there are good both animal and human studies that support using megadoses. 20 milligrams is a very high dose if all you're trying to do is get to sleep. Ironically, although megadoses may help with some cancers, by the way, we did not use them with immune system cancers. It can actually interfere if you're trying to use this to correct your circadian rhythm. Cancers aside, we generally recommend a relatively small dose, maybe a half a milligram, maybe a milligram of time-released melatonin on a regular basis. I'll share with you two things. One is I am fortunate. I've been a very good sleeper my whole life. And two is, despite that, I've been taking a small dose of melatonin nightly for nearly 30 years now. I do so because I'm familiar with the literature, and I'm convinced that, like all of us in this world, hard as I try, I'm overexposed to light at night. So I see it as a melatonin replacement therapy. But for those of you who are dealing with cancer, I would absolutely talk to an informed healthcare provider about this. Your oncologist may or may not be informed, but I would get good information. Again, bottom line, in terms of what I believe, smaller dose, taking it close to bedtime, and the time-released formulation is very critical. And by the way, get good quality. There's a lot of melatonin now that's being imported from China. And if you can, look for a pharmaceutical-grade melatonin. Next question, how can I get relief from restless legs, which interrupts my sleep? Well, there are medications which many of us are no longer recommending because of their side effects. They're dopaminergic medications, and they can actually induce psychiatric symptoms and so on. There is a relatively new device. I'm going to rack my brain trying to remember it. It's a device that you actually, it's a cup, a Velcro cup that you tie around your foot, and the suppression somehow, I don't really understand the mechanism, but it's been shown clinically to dramatically reduce restless leg syndrome. Rick, might you be familiar with that?
No, I'm afraid not. I'm sorry.
If you can give me a second, I believe I can pull it up. I have not talked to patients using it. Let's see if I can find it here. Yes, it's called Restific, R-E-S-T-I-F-F-I-C, Restific. I would recommend you look into that. Again, I don't have direct clinical experience with it with my patients, but the data that I saw looked very convincing. Restific. Next question. How do I measure the quality of my sleep? I love this question because so many people try to measure the quality in terms of quantity. The most common question I get asked is how long should I sleep? Which is like asking how many calories should I eat? And of course, the answer is depends. It's really difficult for the vast majority of us to get good quality without good quantity. And minimum quantity for the vast majority of us, once again, is about 7 hours. It is normal to sleep up to 10 or even more hours for some people. Einstein routinely slept 10 hours a night. So the quantity can vary, I'd say, from 7 to 10. In terms of quality, the best measure of the quality of your sleep is the quality of your waking. If you awaken refreshed, rested, remember in sleep you've been dipped graciously into this fluid serenity, and you want to come up out of it feeling kind of reborn, refreshed. Good dreaming helps with that too. It is normal to have our energy modulate through the day. If you get sleepy in the middle of the afternoon, that has nothing to do with the quality of your nightly sleep. We are all mammals are biologically programmed to nap. So the best measure of the quality of your sleep is the quality of your waking, which I would say also includes your mood during the day. Next question. Having suffered from dysthymia, I've been able to slowly withdraw from using any sleep aids, mainly Zolpidem or Ambien. After several years without sleeping meds, I find myself having very vivid and active dreams. I've had to use another bed so as not to hurt my partner. The dreams are random and irregular, but they do seem to connect. The dreams are random and irregular, but they do seem to connect to my dreams. Maybe waking issues, I don't know. So being chased, having to fight, or defending myself. So number one, vivid and active dreams, I believe, in and of themselves are very healthy. It sounds like you might be describing another condition. You might be describing something we call RBD or REM behavior disorder, REM sleep behavior disorder. If during your dreams you're routinely active and even aggressive, punching, kicking, you're saying being chased, having to fight, if there's large motor movement, I'm not talking about an occasional twitch or vocalization, but large motor movement, I would definitely talk to a sleep specialist about that. RBD, the risk of RBD is increased if you've had a history of using SSRIs, but sometimes it occurs without that. But it is really important, I want to stress, to get this evaluated and treated. One of the most common treatments is a benzodiazepine, clonazepam. If your doctor does suggest that, I strongly encourage you to have your doctor look into the new literature on using melatonin to treat RBD, because it's shown to be quite effective without the unwanted side effects with clonazepam. But please do have this evaluated. I see there are actually more parts to your question. It says it's sometimes difficult to go to sleep because I'm worried about hurting my mate. Okay, sounds like RBD. Suggestions, told to try a mental dialogue with the person. I would not recommend that at this point. I would talk to your sleep doctor or talk to a knowledgeable neurologist, get this evaluated. That's an important first step. And if it is RBD, look into melatonin as a treatment. I want to emphasize it's really important in order to prevent other sequelae to get this evaluated and treated. Next question. Sleep is one thing. I want to know more about dreams and how they can help us deal with cancer. Cool. Hey, Rick, can we take another 3 hours?
There's only one more question after this, so we're pretty much done.
That's a really good question, and I think it's an important question. Let me just say, Carl Jung, who was a great psychologist, and one of his students, Lyda Evans, both were very interested in the relationship of dreaming to cancer. Now, understand what I'm about to say is a hypothetical model, but it's really interesting, and there is some indirect data supporting it. Jung came to believe that the loss of dreams was a factor in cancer. And there's a complex explanation for this, but based on that, it would suggest, and again, we don't have hard scientific data on this, but the model is complex, but it would suggest that it's a good idea not only to sleep well if you're dealing with cancer, but to restore your dreaming. This is one of the positive side effects of melatonin. And let me just say, if you haven't been dreaming well and you start taking melatonin, one of the signs that it's working is the dream dam might break, which means initially you might get pretty intense dreams, maybe even nightmarish dreams, but trust that your dream flow will get restored, and it's a good idea. I have written about the relationship of dreaming to cancer a little bit In my first book, Healing Night, I may have written about it on Huffington Post. I'm sorry, I don't recall. There is a classic book, which is hard to get, by Jung student Elida Evans, written in 1927, called The Psychology of Cancer. And last question. Of course, indica strain of cannabis is used for sleep. Are you in favor of this? I did refer to Hypnos, the god of sleep, as being a stoner, and he actually looks like he's half asleep all the time. This again is an important and I think really complex question. So there's a wave of openness to cannabis use around the U.S. and Canada now, and as you probably know, there have been numerous hybrids of cannabis that have evolved in recent years. I do think there is really good evidence for certain types of medical use, and I totally support that. I am concerned about recreational use. I'm not opposed to that. I think occasional recreational use, like occasional use of alcohol for recreational purposes, is fine. But I did a recent review of the literature, and let me emphasize, it's far from complete. There's a lot we don't know, but it turns out that marijuana indica as well, which is the more sedating kind, actually acts a little bit like alcohol. Some consumption would help with sleep onset. It can help you fall asleep, but in the long run, it actually interferes. It appears to interfere with REM sleep. So I do not encourage dependence on it. Whatever one takes for sleep, I think it's so critical to avoid undermining what we call self-efficacy. In English, we want to not undermine our faith in our own ability, our body, our brain, our mind, our spirit's ability to sleep. So over-reliance on anything can do that. Bottom line, short-term use may be fine. As an appetizer, if you will, to remind you of the taste of sleep, but then putting everything else in place so that you sleep well naturally is ideal.
Thank you.
I think that covers it.
I think it covers. We cannot thank you enough. And some of those questions were just excellent and allowed you to give some great tips and some very good opinions. And I would stress that if any of you have these issues, please raise them with your medical advisors. I do have one quick question for you, Ruben. You mentioned finding a sleep doctor. How would people go about finding a sleep doctor?
I think it's pretty simple. Just Google sleep doctor. Actually, you'll get my buddy Michael Bruce if you do that. He trademarked the term. Again, depending on your community, the best route, of course, would be to ask your primary care provider or your oncologist or doc, for a personal recommendation. There are now ample numbers of sleep physicians around the country. There's been tremendous development and progress in sleep technology. Many sleep studies are now being done at home. So it's not that difficult to find a sleep doctor. If you're dealing with insomnia, if you don't need a full evaluation, and typically with insomnia you don't, then I would recommend finding a CBTI practitioners. And just like healthcare in general, sleep medicine is split. The whole body-mind split affects all of medicine and sleep work as well. So you have mostly physicians, MDs, DOs, doing sleep medicine, the overnight studies, and most of what they treat is sleep apnea and other sleep disorders. They typically treat insomnia with medication. If you're looking for a more comprehensive psychological approach, that is offered more commonly by psychologists who specialize in behavioral sleep medicine. There is a Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine you can access with a listing of hundreds of practitioners around the US and Canada. But there are many psychologists, including myself, who are trained in this. And Rick, if I may, I'd like to put in a plug. If some of you want a more comprehensive involvement in this. I do sleep retreats. I typically do these in Europe. I actually have a 5-day retreat coming up at a beautiful facility in Northern California. It's at a place called Multiversity, and it's scheduled for the first week in April. So if you really want to totally redesign your sleep through immersion, and it's we deal with sleep and dreams and really great depth. Go to my website, and I'm easy to find too. Actually, if you Google my first name, Rubin, R-U-B-I-N, and the word sleep, it's easy to find me. But on my website, there's a listing of events, and you'll see that Multiversity immersion. It's a 5-day sleep retreat.
Thanks.
But,
Thanks, Ruben.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been
No,
a
it's a
pleasure.
pleasure. And I just want to say to everybody, it wouldn't be appropriate for Ruben to say this, but I will say it, that Ruben does offer personal counseling and does a lot of his consultancy over the internet through these virtual meetings and discussions. So if any of you have an interest and are looking for a sleep counselor, just check on Ruben's website. There's information on his own services. And Ruben, thank you so much for doing this. Really, it's been phenomenal. We will be posting this on the website at the link. I put the link up there earlier on. It's on our website, ancan.org. You'll see it in the menu on the left-hand side, and we'll be posting this whole presentation on the website within the next 24 hours, probably sooner. And the slides are also available if you want to download the slides and just look at the slides. Ruben, thanks a million. Good night,
Pleasure, Rick.
everybody.
Good night.